This podcast was recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.
Hello and welcome to The Real Story with Joe Hildebrand. I'm Joe Hildebrand and we are keeping it real this week. An absolutely huge episode. The massive landslide election result in the Northern Territory. It is Australia's smallest state and territory, but it has massive repercussions for Labor governments right around the country. I'll get into the weeds about exactly what it means for our old friend Laura, Law and Order. We've also got the inside goss on the gold mine. Why has Prime Minister Anthony Albanese gone head-to-head with his supposed party and factional ally Tanya Plibersek over a gold mine, a $1 billion gold mine in New South Wales, all over some heritage concerns that have stopped it after 4 years in the making? And we're going to go inside RFK Jr.'s head. Quite literally, we're going inside his brain to find out whether or not, as he has previously claimed, a worm has eaten part of it and then died. We'll also be talking to one of the top national security and counter-terrorism experts in Australia about what is happening in Israel. He's worked very closely with the IDF, got a lot of contacts in Israel, and there is very little about national security and counter-terrorism that he does not know. So we're going to find out whether or not we're heading for World War III. All that and more coming up. But first up this week, we're going to go to something a little bit closer to home, although actually probably not closer to home, because the Northern Territory is another planet. It is just a different place. It is unreal. I love it. My wife worked and lived up there for many, many years, largely to get away from me. But I also love it. I've been up there many, many times myself. I feel like it's my spiritual home. This place is just amazing. The normal laws of nature do not apply, let alone the normal laws of politics. But something very interesting happened over the weekend. The Labor government that has basically held power almost unbroken for 2 decades got absolutely smashed on the way. It's terrible. It's the sort of thing, if you saw it happening playing out in real life, you call the police. This was a political car crash of the most enormous proportions. The chief minister, the leader of the party, lost her own seat. That's how big a landslide it was. So to give you an idea of the scale of it, the Northern Territory, ever since it was created, ever since it got self-government in the 1970s, basically for the first 30 years or so, it was a one-party state, or technically speaking, a one-party territory. The Country Liberal Party, which only seems to operate in the Northern Territory and nowhere else, which is another weird thing, won every single election. Then in about 2001, something changed, something weird happened, and someone who's not that weird at all, Claire Martin, took over, and she became the first Labor Chief Minister in the Northern Territory's history and the first Labor government in the Northern Territory's history. And it has been Labor ever since then, except for one brief term where the CLP got back in and then decided to eat itself alive and then very quickly got punted out again. But in the last election on Saturday, the CLP doubled its seats from about 7 or 8 to about 15 or so, and Labor halved its seats from about the same number to the same number. Now, this is extraordinary. The election before that, the CLP only had 2 seats. So in 2 elections, they've gone to 2 seats to at least 15. And the one reason for it is crime. The one reason for it is law and order. And we all know the scenes in Alice Springs. Everyone's seen what's happening out there. But of course, there are similar stories happening throughout the Northern Territory. We often don't hear about them because they're happening in very remote communities or people just turn a blind eye to it. But eventually, Territorians, who are pretty laid-back, easygoing people, they know they live in probably the most dangerous territory. I mean, there's crocodiles, for Christ's sake, This is not a place where you just take sort of safety for granted. But even for Territorians, the most laid-back and tough people in the world, they've said, nah, this is not enough. We're not taking this anymore. And they have just booted the government to Coventry. And this is something that is actually resonating right round the country. This is something that state governments right up and down the eastern seaboards are also dealing with. And they have very similar characteristics to the Northern Territory government that just got its ass handed to it on a platter. Now, the Northern Territory government, for what it's worth, had been run by the right of the Labor Party. So Labor in the Northern Territory, the right had won it. Michael Gunner, a former chief minister, served for a few years. He stood down and, for reasons best known to himself, didn't really organise a succession plan. And suddenly the left had the leadership and the left had pretty much kind of control of the party. Apparently the left controls most of the branches, but the right controls most of the seats. Not anymore, I would think. But anyway, the left was in control. And the left has always had a problem with law and order. It's always had a problem with taking law and order seriously. And often this is because they're sort of, tertiary educated, nice touchy-feely people who feel a bit of empathy for people who are, committing these sorts of acts and think we have to get tough on the causes of crime. It's not just the crime itself. And they're often living in areas that are immune to these sorts of problems. They're often, again, tertiary educated, affluent, inner city people who are not at the coalface of where these crimes are happening. They're not out there in the regions or out there in the outer suburbs where there's gun crime or knife crime. And so they think, oh no, it's just a right-wing beat-up. It's just a tabloid beat-up. It's just the liberals. It's just the talkback shock jocks. Oh no, it's all just a beat-up. People on the ground, however, tend to have a very different view. And ironically, of course, it is poor people who are most likely to be victims of violence. It's poor people who are the sufferers of street crime, of property crime, of theft, of assault, of domestic violence. And these are the people we should be looking after. These are the people we should be taking care of. But for some reason, the trendy left tends to just sort of downplay it and poo-poo it. And we've seen it time and time again. Not just in the Northern Territory, but of course in Queensland, where they've had regional communities crying out for more support dealing with their law and order things. And you've had people, in the government and on the left generally saying, oh no, it's just all a tabloid beat up. It's all just a media beat up. And of course, we've had that huge debate in Victoria about, Sudanese crime. Can you even say it's Sudanese crime or gang crime? And people saying, oh no, there's no crime here. What are you talking about? It's all fine. Everything's okay. Now, there are several features of all of these governments that are identical. Firstly, all of these governments, the NT, the Queensland and Victorian Labor governments, are all governments run by the left and in their dying days. Now, this is a double whammy because, of course, not only does the left tend not to take crime and law and order seriously as an issue, but if you've been in power for a long, long time, as has the Northern Territory government, or had before it got wiped out, or as has the Queensland government before it's about to get wiped out at the end of this year, and indeed the Victorian government that just seems to keep hobbling along because there is no effective opposition whatsoever, but we'll see if they get wiped out in the next election as well. You have to actually accept that this rise in crime, this rise in violence, this rise in property damage or theft or whatever it is, that all took place under your watch. So you have to actually own responsibility for it. So it's very difficult to acknowledge that there's a problem and therefore very difficult to do anything about the problem because you can't do anything about the problem you don't admit exists. And of course, you're ideologically predisposed to downplay those issues as well. So what do? Well, you just say, no, you're all imagining it. You're all making it up. Oh, you're all victims of, Murdoch propaganda or tabloid propaganda or talkback propaganda. And you tell all these communities that, in fact, these aren't actually real problems and, it's just all in their heads or whatever. That's what people hear at any rate. And we know what happens when people feel like their elected representatives aren't taking them seriously, aren't listening to them, or telling them, or almost gaslighting them, telling them that what they are seeing with their own eyes isn't borne out by the evidence or the statistics. They just go to the ballot box with a brickbat and they whack them. And that's what's happened in Northern Territory. It's exactly what's about to happen in Queensland. And you've got the same thing happening in Victoria where people are saying, had reports saying businesses can't even get people to work for them in the CBD after 6 p.m. because they're so scared for their own safety. And of course, law and order and national security is also the big, big bat that Peter Dutton is using to beat Anthony Albanese around the head with. And so you've seen the coalition try to say that what's happening in the Northern Territory is the fault of the Labor government because they didn't act on Alice Springs and they haven't been tough enough. And of course, we all know that the Labor government is currently dominated by the left. We've got a left-wing Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, even though he's moved to the Senate now and he's awesome. But point being, Dutton is going to absolutely go Anthony Albanese and make him be responsible for the violence on our streets. So this is why that tiny little territory at the top of Australia could actually have a ripple effect on state governments right around the country and the federal government in Canberra itself. Over to the other big issue facing the federal government this week. It's gold, Jerry. It is literally gold. So there is a $1 billion gold mine in central west New South Wales. Well, in fact, there's not a $1 billion gold mine in central West New South Wales. And that is precisely the point. Now, this is a mine that has been proposed by a group called Regis Resources, and it is worth up to $1 billion, almost $1 billion. And it's gone through all the approval processes, all the planning, checks and balances. It's been approved by the New South Wales government. It was about to be approved by the federal government when right at the last minute, Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek said, wow, no, we are not doing it. It turns out that the mine is on an Indigenous heritage site, which means that it has to be kiboshed. Now, this came as a bit of a surprise to the mainstream Indigenous groups, who all wanted the mine because they wanted the jobs and thought this was fantastic for their community. And of course, this came just a few days after Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said that Indigenous communities would benefit most from economic advancement, economic opportunities, that the way to close the gap was to give Indigenous people jobs and the benefits from these big projects in regional Australia that would help them secure their own sort of financial future. Sounded pretty good to me. Sounded pretty good to the Prime Minister. Sounded pretty good to the local Aboriginal people in and around this mine site, which is just near Orange. But according to one sort of slightly fringe or lesser known or obscure Indigenous historian, oh no, this site where the tailings dam of the gold mine was meant to be was actually incredibly sacred. That's the site of certain dreamings and origin stories of Aboriginal spirituality, and therefore it couldn't go ahead. And Tanya Plibersek, Environment Minister, very nice person, lovely person, said, no, you're right, and put the kibosh on it. Now, this alarmed the mine's operators, as you can imagine. In fact, they put out a statement to the ASX and said, you know what, this has just wiped almost $200 million off the value of the project. Instantly, stroke of a pen, $200 million almost gone. But of course, Tanya Plibersek is not just under pressure from her role as Environment Minister, but she's also under pressure in her seat of Sydney, which is under constant attack from the Greens. And you've got crazy lefties like GetUp and the Greens attacking Tanya Plibersek for allowing any mines to go ahead, for allowing pretty much anything, even a brick shithouse being built in the middle of the outback, she gets in trouble for. And so she's trying to sort of appease all these crazy greeny lefties in her inner city seat of Sydney, while at the same time make tough, sensible economic decisions for the advancement of Australia as a whole. But there's also a backstory to Tanya Plibersek and Anthony Albanese, which might just explain what's about to happen next. Because Chris Minns, the fantastic, we should have some superhero music. I think there's some copyright issues with using the theme from Superman.
In a world where there can only be one, Chris Minns is the Premier. Coming to a parliament near you.
But Chris Minns, the superhero Premier of New South Wales from the right faction of the Labor Party, and again, I know I sound like a broken record, but this is really important, comes out after this decision and says, what the F is going on? This is ridiculous. We are disappointed. We are not happy with this. We are going to try to get this mine up and running. We don't understand why this decision was made. 4 years this planning process took place, and then suddenly right at the very end of it, it can't go ahead. And it's fair to say that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, sort of cocked his eyebrow and had a bit of a look and think, you know what? The Premier's looking pretty good right about now. Chris Minns is looking damn fine, if you ask me. And I'm sure Albo didn't use those exact words, but that's what he was thinking. And Albo's come out and said, yeah, no, the mine's going ahead. We are going to make this mine work somehow or other. Now, that pits not just New South Wales Labor against federal Labor, but it also pits the Prime Minister against his own Environment Minister. Now, why is this happening? Well, even though Anthony Albanese and Tanya Plibersek are both from the Labor Party and both from the left of the Labor Party, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're always on the same side. There's a bit of history between these two. No, not that kind of history, but political history. So when Anthony Albanese was running for the leadership of the Labor Party the first time round in 2013, Tanya Plibersek was running against him as Bill Shorten's deputy. Now, this happens all the time. Now, the rules are basically in the Labor Party that it used to be that the right would have the leadership and the left would have the deputy leadership. But either way, you had to have a leader and a deputy leader from opposite factions. Now, that's changed a bit recently and there have been special circumstances. But that's broadly how it works. So that's okay. So Anthony Albanese had Richard Marles as his deputy candidate and Bill Shorten had Tanya Plibersek as his deputy candidate. And so you've got a left leader, right deputy, or a right leader, left deputy. Everyone knows that's how it's meant to be. But the deputies are meant to kind of run dead. The leaders are meant to go against each other. Because otherwise, of course, you would have factions divided and not all uniting behind their candidate, which is precisely what they are supposed to do. And so even though Tanya Plibersek is technically of the left, Anthony Albanese is the king of the left, runs the entire left machine, and all the left are supposed to vote for him as the leadership candidate, notwithstanding the fact that Tanya is running on the ticket of a right-wing candidate. But I'm told, I understand, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but I understand that Tanya was maybe asking for a few votes from the left to help get Bill and her over the line. Maybe. I don't know. But that's what I've heard. And Anthony Albanese, he don't like that. And so he just quietly, I think perhaps, just took note of it. He lost that leadership contest in 2013 and then, of course, won in 2019 after Bill Shorten very nearly won in 2016 and then lost the unlosable election in 2019. And Anthony Albanese is the kind of guy who just remembers. He's got a very good memory. And then, of course, when he won the election in 2022, Tanya Plibersek, who was all set to become education minister, as she'd been shadow education minister throughout the previous period, suddenly gets environment. Now, unkind people say that this was a demotion. Even more unkind people say it was a shafting. Technically, she was just sort of moved sideways, but it was very much seen as him putting Tanya away, down. And this raised a lot of eyebrows at the time. And again, when Tanya Plibersek is sort of putting her neck on the line for this gold mine, Albo's come in and said, no, sorry, actually, no, we're going to make the mine go ahead. But turns out there's no story here whatsoever, nothing to see here at all, because the mine was always going to go ahead. The mine was never blocked, Tanya Plibersek reminded us this week. The mine's tailings dam was just blocked. Of course, the mine needs a tailings dam to function, and the thing with mines is you can't really move them around too much because they've got to be where the stuff is under the ground. But no, the mines operators had other options for the tailings dam, and we could just use those ones instead. Never mind, of course, the fact that it was the option that was approved by the state government and the federal government up to this point that the mine had put forward and was all rubber stamped. But it now seems like this mine that's been blocked, 200 million wiped off, a $1 billion project, turns out it's nothing at all. Nothing at all. It's all fine. It's all going to go ahead and everybody's friends again. Don't you just love politics? Now, I just want to check in quickly with the US, which is being uncharacteristically boring at the moment. Kamala Harris isn't doing any media, so it means she's not making any gaffes or screwing anything up, which is intensely disappointing. Donald Trump is being surprisingly well-behaved. He's been told to stop asking whether or not Kamala Harris is black or Indian or whatever, and he seems to be doing that. So he's being a bit dull as well. Thank God for Robert F. Kennedy Jr., because otherwise we wouldn't have anyone crazy in the race at all. But, shock horror, RFK's dropped out of the race. This is terribly, terribly, terribly sad. It's a dark day for US politics because we now have just one crazy in a race that used to be populated by 2/3 crazy and one crazy cackler. So RFK has pulled out and said he's going to throw in his lot with Donald Trump. He's going to endorse Trump as the candidate. Now, what does this actually mean? Will this even help Donald Trump at all? Well, I opined recently that I wasn't entirely sure if RFK's voting bloc, if you like, would all just go with him to Donald Trump. Now, we all know, of course, that he is a former Democrat. We all know that he is a Kennedy. This is the royal family of the Democrats. And we also all know that he's batshit crazy. So batshit crazy that he said that part of his brain was eaten by a worm that then later died. Now, I have no reason to disbelieve this. In fact, given RFK's behaviour, this is an entirely plausible explanation. But I'm not sure if it's the best platform to be running for president. He's since pulled out of the race because he's realised that given that he's polling between 3 and 5%, he's probably not going to get over the line against either Trump or Kamala. I'm no mathematician. I just did an arts degree, but I'm pretty sure that 3 to 5% doesn't quite get you there. But if all of his supporters were to swing behind Donald Trump like RFK said he was and wanted them to, well, that would put Donald Trump over the top. Again, I'm not entirely sure that the people voting for RFK Jr. are the most, shall we say, disciplined political adherents. And given his sort of weird grab bag of ideas about vaccinations and other things, I think he roasted a dog at one point or ate a barbecued dog or something. And then he told some weird story about catching it. It's just, it makes me go crazy just trying to understand these things. But point being, I'm not sure if they're all going to sort of do what he says, like loyal little soldiers, and go and vote for the big orange man bad. And indeed, a New York Times Siena poll came out over the weekend and found precisely that. So of RFK's supporters, it's gone sort of back and forth, and some people are saying, they're 60-40 Democrats. That was about where they were, I think, when Joe Biden was still the candidate, presumptive candidate. Then when Kamala came along, suddenly they were sort of said to be 60-40 Trump supporters that were voting for RFK before they went back. No one can seem to make up their mind. And this poll by the New York Times over the weekend has found that basically they're split dead evenly. So of the 3 to 5%, or the 5 now down to 3% of people voting for RFK Jr., only about 70%, 2/3 or so, would vote for someone else anyway, because, who else has that special brand of charisma and crazy that RFK brings to the table? And so about 34, 35 would go off and vote for Kamala, and then about 34, 35 would go off and vote for Trump. So there you have it, right there in the numbers. It's official. The impact on the election of RFK Jr. pulling out is exactly 70% of 3/5 of bugger all. Our next guest on the Real Story podcast is something of a polymath. He's hard to pin down. He's done pretty much everything there is to do in areas of counterterrorism, national security, dealing with both Israel and Ukraine, the two current big hotspots around the globe at the moment. He's a former soldier himself, a former counterterrorism expert with the New South Wales Police. He's also a former advisor to Labor Shadow Defence Minister, and you work very closely with the IDF, the Israeli Defence Force, on their operations in counterterrorism. Glenn Kolomeitz, welcome to The Real Story. Lovely to have your company.
G'day, Joe. It's good to be here.
Now, basically, to summarise the situation in the Middle East, it's a clusterfuck. But to put a slightly more nuanced take on it, we've got a new front escalating very heavily in the north of Israel and the south of Lebanon with Hezbollah, which is the dominant military force in Lebanon, bigger than the actual official Lebanese army. And the reason why this is significant and more worrying perhaps than just the Gaza conflict itself, despite the carnage in the south, is because Hezbollah has very, very close ties with Iran. It basically does what Iran tells it to, and Iran makes it do what Iran wants it to do. And if Iran gets brought in, then this raises the prospect of a broader regional conflict because, of course, the other Arab states, the Sunni states, don't like Iran very much because it's Shia. And, of course, if Israel goes to war with another country, then it is going to drag in the United States. This raises the question of how far it escalates, how many countries get involved. Are we looking at the beginning of World War III?
Short answer, no, not in this theatre. In another theatre, possibly.
Right.
We won't talk about
Ukraine. Let's just get to one World War III at a time, and then we'll. But just how serious is this?
Look, firstly, Israel is the master of multi-frontal warfare. It's every war it's been involved in since 1948 has been against armies on multiple fronts coming at them. They were surrounded by an enemy that wants to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So internally, they're very good at moving troops and equipment around and taking up this multi-front fight. And they've actually had a lot of good victories over the years, good tactical victories, not so good strategic victories. But the big issue, I think, is you're quite right. Hezbollah does have enormous arsenal, a lot of people. It's on Israel's only truly vulnerable front, which is the north, the Lebanon border. The rest of the country is pretty much protected by, hard to get into by ground forces and a whole lot of other reasons. And Egypt's out of the equation now; they're in a treaty arrangement. So the Lebanese border, the north, the Hezbollah front is the most vulnerable for Israel. That's where they are getting a lot of the rocket fire now. And we knew that Iran hit them for the first time ever. Actually, hit them a few months back with rockets, and very few got through. Israel has the Iron Dome, so the Iron Dome is a very effective air defense system. They took out a lot of the Iranian missiles, plus Saudis and a couple of other, and the Americans took out a few as well. So,
and just before we go on, just talk us through how the Iron Dome works. It's basically this sort of hyper sophisticated situation where they shoot down. They've got high precision sort of missiles. I think they're working on using lasers now, believe it or not. Where they can detect with great accuracy and target with incredible precision huge numbers of rockets coming in. And so it's this sort of metaphorical dome that protects it. But there's concerns that a mass rocket attack could potentially overwhelm it. If there are just thousands upon thousands of rockets coming at the same time, it might not be able to get them all. Talk us through sort of how
that's
that
exactly
works.
the issue. It's a mobile air defense system, which, as you say, is very, very precise. That way they're not wasting rockets. They identify a threat which is potentially going to hit Israel. It's going to make some damage. Then they'll shoot it down. If it's not going to do any damage, they just let it go. So it saves ammunition. It's a very smart precision system, but it can be overwhelmed. It's subject to being overwhelmed, and that is exactly the risk. And it's mobile, so they'll move around where the threat. Israel has amazing intelligence, right? Because of the situation,
except for that one time in October last year,
and Yom Kippur perhaps, but we won't go that far back. But look, it's a very good system, but it can be overwhelmed. We know that Iran, they launched a pretty big volley last time, very unsuccessfully. They're threatening to send a lot more this time. Look, be that as it may, Hezbollah is the threat. And that's where they've got a lot of stuff. They've got a very highly trained, it's the military there. Lebanon has no military compared to Hezbollah. That's the risk. This is why Israel traditionally uses a tactic of offensive deterrence, where they go in, hit hard to deter, and hence the last two Lebanon wars. And they actually push Hezbollah back as far as Beirut. They haven't done that yet. They've targeted a few rocket sites in Lebanon, but they haven't started this offensive deterrent yet.
Because Israel had previously occupied part of southern Lebanon, and Hezbollah pushed them out, which is part of why Hezbollah is so popular in
Absolutely right. And in fact, the two Lebanon wars, that was one of those, Hezbollah actually had some good tactical victories. Most of the time, Israel had the tactical victories, but there's always a strategic loss for Israel because the world comes in and Israel bashes. Whatever they do, they get smacked. But I think if the intelligence shows there that Iron Dome may be overwhelmed, then I suspect they'll launch into an offensive deterrent mode.
Or preemptive strike, as they call it.
Preemptive strike, that's another way to say it. Yeah. Bear in mind, too, the Israeli Air Force is very, very capable. They have some very good aircraft, F-35s like ours, a whole spectrum, F-16s, F-15s. They are a very good Air Force, and they're very well coordinated with the ground troops too. It's a real manoeuvre warfare approach. So you're very effective.
And just going, so that's the sort of tactical side and how the sort of rockets match up and what will happen, in the back and forth militarily. What I find really weird is it's almost like there's kind of two Lebanons. There's the Hezbollah-dominated south, which just carries on like doing a war of its own, while the actual sort of official, and they've got MPs in the actual Lebanese parliament, which is another weird thing that seems to be run by, I think, about 4 families or something. They share up the parliament between them. So some weird, even I can't get my head around it. I've managed to figure out New South Wales Labor. I still can't figure out Lebanon. But the rest of Lebanon seems to just carry on as if it's a different country, as if it's sort of not happening. So you've got Hezbollah doing whatever it likes, unchallengeable militarily or politically in Lebanon, a proxy of Iran, a foreign government, while the actual sort of official Lebanon, which is, I think, crippled with debt and economic woes, just carries on doing what it's doing and sort of nothing to see here, looks the other way.
Yeah, quite right. And I think that's part of the trade-off. I think Lebanon tolerates Hezbollah being in the south, so to the north of Israel, as long as they don't affect Lebanon's way of life. And because Lebanon isn't a strong military at all, and as you say, it's quite a little oligarchs, little sort of entities floating around. But this is one reason why our government, Australian government, has said that southern Lebanon is a no-go zone for Australians, and if you go there, you can potentially be breaching Commonwealth law. So the Australian government's even separated the Hezbollah south from the rest of Lebanon.
It's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then what is the risk of? And again, there seemed to be this really serious escalation. Everyone went. And then things seem to have kind of pulled back a little bit. It's kind of one of those things where, all right, we don't want this to go any further in case the big dogs sort of come in. But what are the risks, do you think, of Iran actually coming in as Iran, if you like, instead of fighting this war by proxy via Hezbollah? Or do you think that's what they'll continue to do?
The Ayatollahs came out very, very loud and very strong because they had to. Right, in the Middle East, you don't just cop it. You say, we're going to come in, we're going to decimate Israel, we're going to drive them into the ocean, right? That's not happening, and it won't happen. Iran can't put boots on the ground into Israel. There's too many other countries to go
away.
Through,
that's
right?
Who all hate Iran.
Who all hate Iran. That's exactly right. So it's all going to be the missiles. The US have a carrier strike group, either sitting in the Med now or certainly on its way to the Med, which they've said they will help to shoot if Iran decides to start putting missiles back into Israel. They'll help shoot them down, as will the Saudis. Like last time.
And would they, and again, Israel has struck inside Iran previously, as we know, with, again, very high precision trying to take out Hezbollah commanders there. Would the US actually launch missiles into Iran itself?
That's a really good question. That they certainly have committed to shoot, if Iran attacks, helping to shoot down the incoming missiles. I suspect they would, because they've warned Iran not to escalate this, not to take this further. If they start doing what they threatened to do and start putting, I think they said tenfold attack from last time, and Hezbollah can currently do their thing, I suspect the US probably will get involved. Why would you have a carrier strike group there if you weren't going to go further?
Well, that's right. I suppose that the alternative is, are we looking at the kind of mutually assured destruction doctrine, which is that you have so much firepower, so much capacity for Armageddon that it actually encourages people to do nothing, not to actually use it.
That's exactly what I think it is. And the fact they've had a submarine there, they'll never admit this. They said there was a submarine nearby. They're gathering intelligence for a long time. US submarine. Carrier strike group that says, look at us, big carrier, bunch of ships, American flag, don't do anything stupid. The Ayatollahs aren't that stupid. So they're not going, and the new president, in fact, is a moderate. And he's already said, we're not going to get ourselves in the world of hurt here. The Ayatollahs tried to override him. So politically, they know that they're not going to do anything that is going to have US responding on Iranian soil. Right? I highly doubt that, which is why Iran is really relying on its proxies and really relying on Hezbollah to not just launch missiles. I suspect Iran wants Hezbollah to start rolling troops into Israel. Now, that northern border is amazingly defended. In fact, a friend of mine here in Sydney was a commander of that line of defence in the north, right, north of Israel. So I doubt Iran are going to do anything as obvious, as blatant as tenfold missile attacks, but they're certainly going to keep bolstering Hezbollah. They're going to keep bolstering the Houthi, who have now said, well, we are at war with Israel now. And that doesn't affect Israel. That affects the world because of the trade through the Red Sea, that part of the world. So, yeah, I think it'd be limited to the proxy responses without any significant response from Iran.
You mentioned that northern border. I've been there myself as well. And you can see, it's the old Sarah Palin joke. I can see see Russia from my house. But you can see Lebanon from the border, obviously, and you can see these sort of Iranian flags and the Hezbollah outposts. It seems... I remember thinking it was just it was really still and peaceful. It seemed incredibly intimate, and yet it's the center of this kind of regional and potentially global kind of conflict.
Yeah.
You are running as the New South Wales Senate candidate for the Jackie Lambie network at the upcoming federal election, whenever that is. What do you think the Australian government needs to be doing in terms of this this escalation? Is this something we should just be saying, look, this is not our business, this is not our war, this is not our fight. All we need to do is make sure that tensions don't rise at home? or is there some shift in Australia's position on Israel or Palestine that you think needs to be made? What will you be sort of agitating for should you be elected to the Senate?
Firstly, the current Australian government needs to get more balanced about the way they're dealing with Israel, with the whole conflict, but certainly with Israel. Israel is the only democracy in the region. It's an ally. They've given us intelligence in the past when there was a terrorist situation flying out of Sydney Airport. They could potentially have to come to our assistance in the future, not militarily, but diplomatically and in intelligence terms. They need to be very careful. They're walking a very fine line there with Israel. This is our government. What they need to be doing in the short term is what they should have done a long time ago. Contribute more to that Houthi, that Red Sea freedom of navigation, or the Red Sea operation. They've sent over an Australian commander and a bunch of operations staff. That's not good enough. We rely on that traffic for that trade, that shipping for our existence.
And you're a former Labor member, former Labor candidate. You've obviously shifted over to Jackie Lambie now. Is what sort of sowed your disillusion with the Labor Party and caused you to shift across? Because it strikes me that you're exactly the sort of person who should be in the Australian Labor Party and should be sort of providing those voices.
Look, I was strong Labor right, and I was defence advisor to Labor in opposition, and defence is quite a right portfolio. But I found the factionalism just killed me. It was so. I think back then the coalition had been in government for so long that Labor could taste government, but the left was so used to fighting the right that they couldn't then focus on who should have been the real enemy, I suppose, right? So the factionalism killed me, but then I started to see some nonsense in Sussex Street with LD bags of cash and letting people who are under surveillance know they're under surveillance, all this sort of lunacy, right?
Yeah, there were some dark days.
That was some dark days, right? And Glenn said, no, I'm out of here.
Yeah, no worries. Well, look, Glenn Kolomeitz, an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for your insights. They are extremely wise and penetrating as always. And thanks for joining us here on The Real Story.
Thanks, Joe. It's a pleasure.
And that's it for us at The Real Story. If you like what you hear, leave us a comment or a review and hit the 5-star button. I don't think any of the other buttons work, so just hit the 5-star one. If you don't like what you hear, I don't care. Just hit the 5-star button, okay? If you want to get in touch with us, want us to talk about anything you're interested in, ask us a question, whatever you want, send us an email, therealstory@novapodcast.com.au, or you can direct message me on Instagram because, yes, I'm a middle-aged white man on Instagram. That's just how I roll. My handle, is that what the young people call it, is @Joe_Hildebrand. I've also got a Hotmail address. So, just deal with that, millennials. And we will be back next week. If you miss me too much, you can always read me in the Daily Telegraph on Mondays and Saturdays. But otherwise, I'll speak to you soon.